Most men spend their lives reacting, powerful men don't. That's the difference. The average person moves emotionally, chasing validation, defending their ego, needing approval, panicking under pressure. But the men who dominate industries, influence rooms, and quietly shape outcomes tend to think differently, colder, slower, more strategically, because power is rarely built through impulse. It's built through control, the ability to detach from emotion long enough to see situations clearly, while everyone else is trapped inside their reactions. And history keeps proving this over and over again. Kings, generals, billionaires, political strategists. The men who rise to the top are not always the loudest or most talented. They're usually the ones who understand human nature better than the people around them. So before we get into this, subscribe to the channel and send this to someone who still believes powerful thinking is about motivation instead of discipline. In 1911, a young journalist visited John D. Rockefeller expecting to meet one of the most aggressive businessmen in history. After all, Rockefeller had built one of the largest business empires the world had ever seen through ruthless strategic expansion. His name was associated with immense wealth, influence, and power. People described him as calculating, almost machine-like in business. But what surprised the journalist wasn't intimidation, it was calmness. Rockefeller spoke slowly, carefully, emotionlessly. While other businessmen reacted impulsively to pressure and competition, he appeared detached, almost impossible to provoke emotionally. And that trait appears repeatedly throughout history among powerful men. Not emotionlessness, control over emotion, because powerful thinking rarely comes from panic. It comes from distance. The ability to step outside emotion long enough to analyze situations clearly, while everyone else is trapped reacting instinctively. Most people never develop that skill. They think emotionally first and strategically second. A powerful man reverses that process. That's why average individuals often misunderstand powerful people completely. They assume confidence means arrogance. They mistake emotional restraint for coldness. They confuse patience with weakness. But underneath those traits is usually something far more dangerous: discipline. Look at military commanders throughout history. The generals who survived chaos were often not the loudest men in the room. They were the ones capable of remaining calm while everyone else collapsed emotionally. During World War II, strategic leaders constantly faced incomplete information, uncertainty, fear, and immense pressure. A commander reacting emotionally could cost thousands of lives. So the most effective leaders learned to think differently, slowly, deliberately, without emotional panic clouding judgment. Because emotional reactions narrow perception, calmness expands it. And this applies far beyond war. In business, negotiations, politics, and relationships, the person most emotionally controlled usually has the advantage. The moment someone becomes desperate, angry, defensive, or impulsive, they become predictable. Predictable people are easier to manipulate. That's one reason powerful men often appear difficult to read emotionally. Not because they feel nothing, but because they understand emotional exposure creates vulnerability. A negotiator who appears desperate loses leverage. A leader who panics publicly weakens authority. A man who constantly seeks validation reveals insecurity. So powerful thinking becomes centered around emotional management, observation before reaction, strategy before impulse, long-term outcomes before short-term emotion. This is also why highly disciplined individuals often seem disconnected from distractions consuming everyone else. While most people chase immediate gratification, attention, comfort, approval, entertainment, powerful thinkers usually focus obsessively on positioning, leverage, influence, future consequences, because they understand something most people ignore. Short-term emotion often destroys long-term power. Niccolò Machiavelli wrote extensively about this while observing rulers and political systems in Renaissance Italy. Niccolò Machiavelli, he noticed powerful leaders often succeeded not because they were morally superior, but because they understood human nature realistically instead of emotionally. People respond to perception, strength, certainty, fear, duty, and the men who understood those psychological dynamics gained influence over those who didn't. But perhaps the most important trait powerful men develop is selective attention. They understand attention is energy, and energy is finite. Most people waste enormous mental energy reacting to criticism, drama, emotional chaos, social comparison, and distractions that produce no real value. Powerful individuals tend to filter aggressively. They protect focus because focus compounds results over time. That's why many elite performers appear repetitive, disciplined, even boring externally, because consistency creates power, not emotional excitement. And this mindset changes social behavior too. Powerful men rarely feel the need to prove themselves constantly. They don't argue with every critic. They don't chase validation from everyone around them. They understand over-explaining weakens presence. Calm certainty feels stronger than emotional defense. Always. And once you start observing history, psychology, and human behavior carefully, you realize powerful men are often operating according to a completely different mental framework than the average person around them. One of the biggest misconceptions about powerful men is that they're fearless. They are not. They simply think differently about fear. Most people experience fear and immediately retreat, hesitate, overreact, or seek comfort. But powerful individuals often treat fear as information instead of command. They pause, analyze the situation, and continue moving strategically despite discomfort. That's a massive psychological difference because the average person is controlled by emotion. A powerful man learns to control emotion before emotion controls him. And that mental shift changes everything. Look throughout history. Many influential leaders, businessmen, military strategists, and elite negotiators faced enormous pressure constantly. Public criticism, isolation, betrayal, uncertainty, competition. But the individuals who maintained influence long-term usually shared one characteristic: emotional stability under pressure, not perfection, stability. Because when everyone else loses composure, the calmest person naturally appears more powerful. That's human psychology. People instinctively trust certainty during chaos. This is also why powerful thinkers are usually highly selective about who influences them emotionally. They understand environment shapes mindset. Weak environments create weak thinking. Constant distraction destroys focus. Emotional chaos weakens judgment. So they guard their attention aggressively, not because they hate people, because they understand attention determines direction. What you consume repeatedly eventually shapes your perception, habits, emotional state, and identity. Powerful men know this intuitively. That's why many of them operate with strict routines, controlled social circles, disciplined schedules, and intentional distance from unnecessary drama, because discipline protects clarity, and clarity protects power. Another thing powerful men understand is delayed gratification. While average individuals seek immediate emotional rewards, approval, comfort, entertainment, status signaling, disciplined thinkers often sacrifice short-term pleasure for long-term positioning. That's uncomfortable, which is why most people never do it consistently. Building influence, wealth, authority, knowledge, or leverage usually requires enduring long periods where results are invisible. Most people quit during that stage because emotional impatience overrides strategic thinking. But powerful men think in years, sometimes decades. They understand compounding psychologically, financially, and socially. Small disciplined actions repeated consistently create enormous long-term advantages. And perhaps that's why truly powerful individuals often seem detached from public opinion. They can't afford to let every criticism alter direction emotionally. The moment a person becomes dependent on external validation, they become easier to influence. That's why calm self-control feels intimidating. A man who cannot be emotionally manipulated becomes difficult to dominate psychologically. He listens carefully, observes quietly, responds deliberately, and because of that, people often project authority onto him automatically, not through force, through presence. But here's the important distinction most people miss. Powerful thinking is not about becoming cold, arrogant, or emotionless. It's about becoming disciplined enough that emotions stop controlling your decisions blindly. Because uncontrolled emotion destroys more men than lack of intelligence ever will. Impulsive anger destroys opportunities. Desperation destroys leverage. Ego destroys judgment. Neediness destroys respect. But discipline quietly builds power over time. That's why the strongest men are rarely the loudest ones in the room. They don't constantly need attention because their confidence isn't built on external approval. They understand themselves, control themselves, and think independently under pressure. And in a world filled with distraction, emotional manipulation, and endless noise, that mindset has become increasingly rare. So the next time you study a truly powerful man, look beyond money, status, or appearance. Watch how he thinks, how he reacts under pressure, how he handles emotion, how carefully he chooses where to invest attention and energy. Because real power usually reveals itself psychologically long before it reveals itself externally. And if these conversations about psychology, discipline, influence, and power resonate with you, stay connected to this channel. There's always another layer beneath what society teaches on the surface. Until next time, protect your focus, master your emotions, and think further ahead than everyone around you.